So anyways, this motion effect can go screw itself. I've given up completely on using that thing for this. So I found something cool about SFPA, a doodle art / stickman platformer game that followed up the Flash game series. It's been a while since I've made a video on the game, so first off, before I discuss this, I'll give you a bit of backstory. Just over 2 years ago, I emailed the game's developer Brad Bourne about some issues, like the lack of progress reset or profiles, and also the slowdown issue I had. So flashback to now, the game was updated 10 months ago. There's now a profile screen visible on the game's startup, which I think was planned. There's still no way to return to the screen from the game though, like in the pause menu. Kind of annoying. And also, wouldn't that have been relatively easy to add compared to that whole profile interface? Anyway, it also fixed the slowdown. And there's also a low memory mode, which lowers the game's quality to make it more performant. Maybe that's partly because I told Brad in the email about the slowdown issue. He actually replied to my email and did not understand this issue at all, but that's not really surprising. What he said was, I don't know about the performance hit. He thought by slowdown, I meant like performance issues, lagging, choppiness. But the version that had the issue ran at the same slow speed constantly, and didn't seem to be lagging because of performance. It felt more like a slow motion issue. So I've since found out what's going on here. For some reason, in the slow version of the game, as I know it, the first update that I got, it moves the player and enemies by a fixed amount each frame, taking no regard to the frame rate. So whether it's running at 30 frames per second or 60, making the game speed dependent on frame rate. This problem is one that game developers and also game engines are all too aware of. So instead, movement should be based on time in between each frame, and that would also account for lag. So the game's frame rate here is linked to the refresh rate of my display. This can be changed in system preferences under the display section. This actually makes sense for it to work like that. If the screen's refreshing 30 times per second, why would you render the game any faster than this, like 60 frames per second or even more? Obviously the actual problem here is the amount of movement per frame is staying the same. So this 1920 by 1080 setting is the default for this display, and that renders in 4K, so technically 3840 by 2160. If I change that to 1080p though, it actually renders in 1920 by 1080. I found that makes things a bit faster, and also allows me to change the refresh rate from 30Hz to 60Hz, which in 4K is not supported, because that's actually 4 times the amount of total pixels because it's doubling in both dimensions. Anyways, it's now refreshing at 60 times per second, causing the slow version to play at normal game speed. Anyways, let's look at Brad's response again. He gave me an access code to the beta version of this game through Steam, which is basically an experimental testing version before the final release. Thing is though, I didn't know this because I couldn't figure out what PW means until later, when I realized it meant password. So the way to enter a code for a Steam beta is to right-click on the game and select Properties, then select the Betas tab, punch in the code, and hit enter. So in this version, there's this sort of blank pause menu option that opens a hub interface where you can basically go to any area regardless of your progress point. There's also a few features here that might be made for developers or game testers. Pressing the I key reloads the area that you're in at your current position. The R key will take you to the area's entry point. The slash key will cause the game to glitch out or make the enemies and objects invisible and you can still get hit by them. If you hit 0, it reloads the area at like a different point sometimes. And now for that really interesting thing I found, which is E or W. Holding down either one of these keys activates slow motion mode, making the game run 8 times slower than normal. But it still runs at 60 frames per second in real time. Maybe it's to visualize problems with the game somehow. But then why does it not reduce the real-time frame rate? Also, why do I want to talk about that to begin with? It sounds boring. Well, hang on here. The game can actually be quite fast moving. I did do a speedrun of the basement Spire stage a while back, but it was far from perfect. And also I didn't slide or roll at all, which is where you hold the down arrow key while landing, and it can give you more of a boost from jumping off steep inclines. By doing that more times in a row, you can accumulate high velocity in some areas. Okay, but that has more to do with COVID than slow motion, right? Well, let me finish. Motion blur is used in many fast-moving games. A prime example of that being Sonic the Hedgehog games, because of course the word Sonic means the speed of sound. Again, this slow mode runs smoothly at 60 FPS in real time, so that translates to 480 FPS at normal speed. So when I found this, I thought maybe I could try and add a motion blur effect to gameplay footage of SFPA, by recording the game while holding the E key to create a long video of the slow gameplay, and using the extra frames to create motion blur, by averaging every 8 frames of that into 1 frame of a sped up version. In fact, something similar to that has been done with Sonic Unleashed, by recording the Empire City level at 1/4 of normal speed, speeding that up, and applying motion blur, using the extra frames for motion tracking. So it also sounds like maybe this is using something like optical flow analysis to generate an even slower motion clip with in-between frames or something. But it sounds like you still need to do something like what I'm thinking of in the end. Regardless, it does look incredibly cool. Motion blur is also produced by cameras, because no camera on Earth can expose for an infinitely short point of time to get a picture. So not only would it add that much depth, it's something you would naturally expect. So I want to demonstrate what it would look like if, say, a motion blur slider could be added to this game, which maybe that would be done differently, like by drawing the game's scene and then each of the characters separately, and applying a directional blurring effect to each of them. And on a side note, I also think that being able to set the resolution of the game to a custom setting would be good, instead of having it be dependent on the window size. Although, there could still be a checkbox for that. Also, setting a custom game resolution would force the window's aspect ratio to be fixed. Now, some of the game's animations are made frame by frame to be 60 FPS at normal game speed, instead of interpolating between keyframes. So those animations will not be affected by this method of motion blur. But those are smaller movements, and the actual movement of things like the game's camera and the player in relation to the camera are more important. And when the player moves, the animations will blur out anyway. So of course the first step was to record the video, and that would have taken 2.5 minutes at normal game speed, meaning it took 20 minutes in slow motion. Goes without saying that took quite a bit of patience. It does make the game easier in a way, so if you know what a tool-assisted speedrun is, I guess that's kind of what this is, but with fewer tools at your disposal.
We've reached the Rogueport docks, and once I gain control of Mario, you'll see that I continuously jump, making use of a trick called speed swap. In this game, your up and down or Z-axis speed is about 19% faster than moving left and right across the X-axis. As it turns out, you can move up or down for 1/60th of a second, or 1 frame, and continuously jump on the first frame possible to preserve this larger speed value.
The slow motion mode does make it kinda difficult to tell where you're headed though, because I'm used to playing the game at normal speed. So if you make a mistake and then you want to fix it, good luck, because you'll have to try it all over again, and it takes 8 times longer. So a program like Dolphin that can be used to create TAS speedruns would have at least some way of controlling the game speed, manually advancing frames, or even have state saving so you can save, reload from that point, and fix mistakes. Anyways, once I finish the recording, I save that, put that into Final Cut, and sped it back up by 8 times. But how do you do what I'm thinking of? Well, the process for doing that is a lot easier said than done, and really obscure. So we got the 5 Pro Apps bundle a while back, which has Final Cut, Logic, Compressor, and Motion. Motion lets you create Final Cut effects, and if you create one, there's an option to enable motion blur and a couple of settings. But I can't tell exactly what these do. So it seems like this samples value is the quality of the motion blur, so the amount of frames it will blend into every frame of the project. So I tried setting that to 8, and the shutter angle of 360, because I want to blend all of those every 8 frames into each normal speed frame, which would be sort of like keeping the shutter open for the full time of every frame. By the way, this is 60 FPS after all, so the frames are pretty short. So I saved the effect and swapped over to Final Cut. But once I applied the effect to the video, it didn't seem to exactly do this. Instead, it seemed to be blending 8 of the video frames, but like spaced out by some amount of time that seems arbitrary to me, like jumping that length to fetch nearby frames. That's not taking advantage of the extra frames at all, and it creates this jarring, really echoey, sort of dazed motion blur effect. It looks dreadful. So I tried slowing the clip back down to normal, because maybe it's blending 8 frames of the project instead of 8 frames of the actual video, but it made no difference. Even after I tried deleting and reapplying the effect, I also tried decreasing the shutter angle and increasing the sample to try and compensate, but I was never able to get it to remotely the effect I was thinking of. And I don't have any idea, like this doesn't at all make it clear what these settings do, or what settings to use to do what I'm thinking of, or if that's even possible. I also don't think I'm the only one that wants to do this, because there are people that want to create motion blurred time-lapse videos, like record in real time and then do this. That's how I found this method, but I just can't get any control from it. There was an echo effect in Adobe Premiere, but it does seem a bit confusing as well. Maybe it could do what I'm thinking of if you get the settings right, but obviously I'm using Final and I don't have that. There's also a Trails effect in Final, but it has equally confusing duration and echo settings that don't make it clear at all what it does. And it also has some color blending settings, so it obviously isn't really motion blur, it seems. It shouldn't even be that obscure anyway. Motion blur does seem like a common thing you would want to create, and if that was easier, it would be used more among video creators that use Final Cut. There should be an actual motion blur effect in Final Cut that has sensible settings for this kind of thing. Like, first of all, whether to base the effect on the frames of the project, so motion blur in parentheses, or the actual video if it's applied to a video, so frame blending in parentheses. If it's set to video, it would show previous frames value that blends that amount of frames together, and spacing, which would skip that amount of frames for each previous frame it fetches, which would widen the effect. It could also have an adjustable shutter curve, and also an optical flow subframes value that when you change it, it automatically uses optical flow to generate a video with more frames in between each, making the other settings based on that video. But then if it's set to project, it would show a samples value and a time value, and next to time, a drop down for frames or seconds. If it's a video, it would only look at the video frame that the current project frame is in range of, unless you check the Blend Video Frames checkbox. It's more for if objects are being animated using keyframes. So if samples is 8 and time is 2 in frames, it would loop from where it should be at the current frame through 8 positions in between those 2 frames to where it should be 2 frames ago, and blend those together by averaging them. Which maybe the motion effect is for, but first of all, should you really need to create a motion effect and find an obscure motion blur setting and save it so that you can use it in Final Cut? And also, you can't change the settings in Final Cut. You have to go back to motion, save the effect, and swap back to seriously. It could also have a both setting, which lets you control both the sampled blur settings, and if it's a video, the frame blending options as well. So anyways, this motion effect can go screw itself. I've given up completely on using that thing for this. I thought of another way of getting motion blur where I actually know what's going on. I'm calling it the manual motion method, because it has to be catchy, of course. First, I had the clip at normal speed because I needed the video frames to line up with the frames in the timeline. I copied the clip and stacked it on top of each other until I had a stack of 8 clips. Next, I zoomed in heavily on the project until I could see the clip snapping to frames when I moved them, and moved each one to the right by a number of frames is equal to its place in the stack. Then, I adjusted the opacity of the clips to 100% divided by its place in the stack, so leave the first one as its default, and set the opacity of the second clip to 50, the third one to 33.3%, 25, 20, 16.6, etc. This will mix everything below each clip with itself, and that should overlay them in a way that evenly mixes the clips together. And because of how they're moved, it should be mixing a trail of the first clip and the previous 8 frames trailing behind. I also disabled the audio for everything except the first clip. I did experiment with trying to leave them on, but that made it sound even worse. Then I created a compressor setting and set the frame rate to 15 FPS. So that would export 1 frame for every 4 frames of the actual project. So repeat exporting 1 and skipping 3. Then, I added that as an export destination in Final Cut and used that to export it. And even then, it still took like over an hour. Maybe over an hour and a half. Maybe it would be faster if Final Cut had the effect I'm talking about, or something similar, and I could just apply it to the clip and set a couple of values instead of stacking 8 clips. And I could actually speed up the clip to 8 times before exporting. which would already make it twice as fast as using the 15 FPS workflow. So anyways, the result of that is a 20-minute slow motion gameplay clip that plays at 15 FPS, with the motion blur effect applied to it. It would be 60 FPS if it was sped up 4 times, and then you'd have to speed it to double that to get to normal game speed. So I did that, and finally, this actually creates normal looking game footage with smooth motion blur. Here's a comparison beside the same clip without the motion blur. It really helps sell the motion to the eye. So I'll break that final video off and upload it separately, because now I don't want to bury it in this one. So for that, as well as sources, you can check the description of this one. Well, I hope you found that interesting, so that wraps this up. Feel free to comment or otherwise support this channel if you want, and as always, thanks for watching.